This is the second part of my look into the murder of Yvonne Laker. If you haven't heard it already, I suggest you go back and listen to part 1 before this one. Thank you to all of you who have ignored how terrible I am at providing regular content and chosen to support Outlines by signing up on Patreon. If you fancy joining them, it's only £3 a month, and it makes so much difference to my ability to cover the costs involved in researching, writing and hosting a show like this one. This episode of Outlines contains descriptions of the murder of a child, and as such, listener discretion is advised. On Thursday the 11th of February 1982, a short article ran on page 2 of the Bolton News. Entitled Tragedy of an Ex-Chef, it began, Mr. Derek Pye, aged 44, desperately tried to stop drinking and gave up for a year, but he died from a lethal dose of tablets and alcohol. Derek had been living in Bolton with his cousin, Salvation Army officer Charles Pike, and though no one knows for sure whether he was intending to kill himself that day, Charles recalled that on a separate occasion, shortly before his death, Pye had been found suffering from what was described as the effects of drug and drink. Derek, who had taken to regularly drinking 2 bottles of vodka a day, had, shortly before his death, written a letter to his cousin, of which only one line survives. I tried it, and it did not work. The death of Derek Pye would draw a line under the story of a man who, despite seemingly understanding that the root of his problems lay in his abuse of alcohol, could never find the strength to fully overcome his addiction, and, when he was drinking, there was often trouble. In a short biographical statement on his personal website, Derek's son talks about his upbringing, saying, "My father was an alcoholic and never lived with us for long periods due to frequent spells in prison." Today's episode is the second of 2 parts, and in the main it looks at the autumn and winter of 1964, and Derek Pye, then 27 years old, sometimes still away from his death by pills and alcohol, but already heading into his addiction, who, at that time, stood accused of the murder of 15-year-old Yvonne Laker. I've not known how to begin this episode, whether to tell you immediately about Derek's struggles in the years surrounding his acquittal, or whether to tell you afterwards, but in the end, I've opted to begin with them, because if I leave them until later, I'm in danger of allowing the narrative to lead your thinking, when, truthfully, I don't really know what to think myself. What I do know is that Derek was acquitted of murder, and as much as this is a telling of that story, it's also another, about a man who tried it, but it did not work. One who, in the words of his son, allowed his deep inner emotions, desires, and demons to rule him. I'm Jess Carter, and this is the Outlines podcast. When you search through newspaper archives, Derek's name begins to appear semi-regularly. Not, as far as I can see, before the murder of Yvonne Laker, but afterwards, every few years, there he is. The first time is in March of 1965, with an article which begins, "Whenever there was a fire, Derek Pye seemed to be around. He would tell people that fires had started. He knew this because he had started them himself." This was the claim of Mr. Jeremy Hutchinson, QC, prosecuting Derek at Winchester Assizes, just a few months after he'd been acquitted of the murder of Yvonne Laker. On March 23, 1963, the day after two of the barn fires, Pye was interviewed by Detective Sergeant John McLaren and told him that the previous evening he had borrowed a bicycle to go to some pubs in Newbury, and that, when he returned, he saw two barns in the neighbourhood had caught fire. This wasn't the first time that Pye had witnessed barn fires, however. According to herdsman George Thomas, on August 2, 1962, he had heard Pye tapping on his window to tell him that two of his barns were ablaze. George recalled that he was surprised. He had only checked the farmyard 10 minutes prior to that, and had seen nothing amiss. During the trial, the court heard that, in all, Pye was accused of maliciously setting fire to 4 barns in North Hampshire, setting fire to furniture at an address in Grove Road, Basingstoke, as well as breaking into the same house. The jury eventually found him guilty of setting one of the barns alight, as well as the housebreaking and theft, but he was cleared of the 3 other arson charges, as well as another offence, of wounding his wife with a view to committing GBH. All in all, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. What is interesting about these arson charges is that, reportedly, none of them had been brought against Pye until September of 1964, after he had already been charged with murder. It appears as if before this point, authorities had not realised that, whenever there was a fire, Derek Pye seemed to be around. Nor had they yet made a connection between the voyeuristic nature of his stories, the 4 fires which he happened to be there to witness, and the murder of Yvonne Laker, dragged into a train toilet by an unknown man, an act which Derek Pye just happened to be there to witness too. In the book Great Train Crimes, Murder and Robbery on the Railways by Jonathan Oates, the author writes about this sighting, concluding that, to have done nothing, nor to have realised what he was seeing, Pye must have been, and this is a quote, not very quick-witted. Yet his son described Derek as having been an intelligent man, and he follows it with that quote I referenced earlier. He was intelligent, but he allowed his deep inner emotions, desires, and demons to rule him. 2 years on from his conviction, Derek's name can again be found in the papers. This time he stood accused of taking and driving away a car, and of breaking into a bungalow where he was alleged to have slashed a woman's underwear. The car belonged to his employer, Mr. Frank Pluckrose, a self-employed painter and decorator. The bungalow, too, was Frank's. The paper reported that Frank's wife June left with her family on July the 22nd for a week's holiday, and when they returned, they found a window smashed in the door, the car missing, and her underwear, which had been left on the hall stand, had been slashed. In all, a record player, 2 typewriters, alcohol, and cash to the sum of around £51 had been stolen. Pye was interviewed by Detective Sergeant William Durant, who already knew of Derek from Yvonne's murder. He'd been part of the team who were responsible for interviewing and compiling the case against him. This time, Derek admitted to having the car, but again he separated himself from what had happened, claiming that he borrowed it from a man in the House at Home pub in Basingstoke. He said, "It was from a chap by the name of Jimmy. I don't know his other name. My mother told me to take it back, or she would shot me, so I did." Despite his claims of semi-innocence, in November of 1967, he was sentenced to 30 months for the burglary. In sentencing, it's interesting to note that it was reported that there was nothing in his medical notes to indicate that Derek should be treated as what is described as a mentally disturbed person. His defence, a Miss Rashina Hare, told the court that Pye now realised that drinking was the cause of his difficulties and asked that he be given treatment in prison. I've tried to find some statistics relating to alcohol abuse and the link to criminal behaviour in the 1960s, but have been unable to. What I have found is the website alcoholchange.org.uk, which gives a more contemporary overview of the problem. It tells me that in England there are an estimated 602,391 dependent drinkers, and of those, only 18% are receiving treatment for their condition. The same site states that in 2015 to 2016, in England, victims of crimes believed that an offender was under the influence of alcohol during 39% of all violent incidents. In 2017 to 2018, in England and Wales, in 24% or 39,000 incidents of robbery cases, the victims believed the offender to be under the influence of alcohol. Between 2014 to 2016, in England and Wales again, 91% of violent incidents which took place in or near a pub or club were alcohol-related, and 67% of those which took place in public spaces, again, were related to drinking. These are just some of a long list of statistics related to violence, criminal behaviour, and alcohol consumption. In his biography, Derek's son tells of how it was his mum who raised the children while Derek was in and out of prison. He says, "What we missed out on in terms of money or luxuries, my mum made up for with love and support." It was when Derek was home and had gone back to drinking that the problems arose. His son says, "Emotional and physical abuse often came as part of the unwelcome package." He calls him a sad example of a father. There's another mention of Derek in the papers, before things go quiet, and this is in 1970, when he was in court again, this time for stealing from a fish and chip shop, where he reportedly was working as a manager. He told the court, "I was going to Brighton to get a job as a manager of a boarding house. I had given in my notice 3 weeks before." He said that he had been going to start a new life and denied knowing anything about the money, but he was found guilty and sent to prison again, this time for 2.5 years. So that's Derek Pye for you. At least, that's the Derek Pye that I can piece together. He was a man who struggled with alcohol throughout adulthood, eventually losing his family and then his life to his addiction. But back in 1964, as Derek's murder trial began, he was still in his mid to late 20s, and the bulk of his problems were yet to come. The trial was in some ways just the beginning. So now let's go back to 1964, and I'll tell you everything I can about Derek's movements that day and what it was which made police believe that he was the man responsible for the murder of Yvonne Laker. In case you aren't listening to this episode off the back of part 1 and need a quick recap of what happened, 15-year-old Yvonne Laker was killed on Monday the 29th of June 1964 as she travelled home from her grandparents' house on the train between Southampton and Reading. It was somewhere between the stations of Winchester and Basingstoke that the murder occurred. Her throat had been slit with a broken bottle in the train's toilet compartment, and while she had first been knocked unconscious with a blow to the head, probably with the same bottle used to kill her, she had not been sexually assaulted, nor had she been robbed. Her watch and all the money in her purse was still intact. Her murder was, as prosecutor Mr. H.E.L. McCreary said, more horrifying because it was apparently a crime without motive. This was further elaborated on, saying, "The prosecution does not suggest any motive for this crime. Of course, it does not mean the crime was motiveless. You may take the view that people who do this kind of thing sometimes have reasons that we can all understand, and sometimes have reasons which are beyond the understanding of ordinary folk. It may be for some perverted reason, may be due to imbalance, anger, or rage. When laying out the evidence for the prosecution, Mr. McCreary said that it would be established that Derek Pye got onto Yvonne's train at Winchester, suggesting that Yvonne was sitting in her seat beside the window with her holdall beside her. Sitting beside her or in front of her was the murderer, the accused, holding in his hand an empty sherry bottle. He struck her with the bottle, a violent blow on the left side of her head. That the blow was struck while the child was in her seat was clear, because glass fragments had been found on the sill of the window beside the child's seat, and on top of her holdall. If the child was conscious after the blow, she must have been in a state of complete terror. In that state of being unconscious or semi-conscious, in a state of shock, she was dragged along the floor of the coach. Her throat was undoubtedly cut in the lavatory where she was found. While the prosecution were convinced that this was what had happened to Yvonne that day, the story which Derek Pye told, the one which landed him in court in the first place, was markedly different. His version was that he had gone to use the toilet, and when he returned there was a girl who, he later learned to be Yvonne, leaning up against a man. Pye recounted how he saw the man steady her in the gangway, and that he said to him, "What's wrong?" recalling how the man replied that she had been sick. Pye said he took the girl into the toilet and was in there for 2 or 3 minutes. The man reached for the door, and I held it open for him, moving out of the gangway into the space between the seats. I sat down again and pushed the door shut. I didn't see them together again. He came out and closed the door. I said, "Is she all right now?" And he replied, "Mind your own business," or words to that effect. The man, he said, was about 30 years old, 5'8" or 9" in height, dark-haired with a full face. He was wearing a sports jacket with coloured flecks, a white shirt and a tie, and dark trousers. Pye claimed that when he went back into the carriage, he saw that there were 3 pieces of broken glass on the seat and on the floor of the carriage. He said, "I picked them up and threw them out of the window, because I thought they were rather dangerous." This version of events was the only one Derek Pye ever told. He never deviated, not even once, from the facts he laid out in his initial interview. So, what were the events which had led Derek to be on the train at all? It wasn't a regular occurrence for him, but that day the unemployed farm worker had been on the hunt for a job, and in a roundabout way it was this which led him to Winchester, and then onto Yvonne's train. The book Great Train Crimes, Murder and Robbery on the Railways lays out what happened to Derek that day. It tells of how he had taken a bus to Basingstoke at around 9:30 in the morning. By 11 a.m. he was apparently in the Anchor Inn looking for a solicitor, who he reportedly later found, though it's unclear as to why he was in need of one. At 1 p.m. he had taken the wrong train from Basingstoke. His intention was to go directly to Winchester, but instead he travelled in the other direction, where he ended up in Reading. From Reading, he took the next train back again, finally arriving at Winchester, where his intention was to visit the Royal Marines Recruitment Service. The Nottingham Guardian reported on the 18th of September that giving evidence at the trial was Mr. Richard Angle, the careers officer for the Navy and Marines in Winchester. Mr. Angle recalled that shortly after 3 p.m, Pye dropped by his office in Station Hill to discuss the possibility of signing up. He said that Derek appeared perfectly calm and that there were no signs that he had been drinking. By 3:25, Pye was back at the station, ready to catch the train home. This is how Derek claimed to find himself on Yvonne's train, the only witness to her murder. However, not realising what it was he had seen, he got off of the train at Basingstoke before her body was discovered and went to the Grapes pub. He had a drink, and it was there that he bought a half bottle of Quester sherry before continuing on to Reading, where, at 6 p.m, he took another train to Hook. From there, he took a taxi to Odium, where he had reportedly left his bicycle. Then he cycled home, apparently returning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock p.m. A neighbour who saw him that evening said that he appeared completely normal. The book's chapter claims that when police investigated Derek's account of the day, they found that there were certain inconsistencies in his story. There was, as he stated, a train to Hook, though it was at 5:41 p.m. and Pye reportedly did not take it. Instead, they found an old school friend of his who claimed to have seen him at Reading Station at 7:30 p.m. They were also unable to find a taxi driver who could remember taking anyone to Odium that evening. As for the matter of the Quester sherry, Pye's claim that he had bought it that evening was refuted by the licensee, who believed it was actually at 1 p.m, although no one who spoke to Pye that afternoon seemed to recall him being drunk or even under the influence in any way. One of the prosecution's main pieces of evidence was that a fragment of green glass, which was reportedly the same as those found at the murder scene, was discovered in the pocket of a blue-striped suit, which Derek claimed was the one he was wearing on the day of the murder. His clothing had been taken into evidence by Detective Sergeant William Durrant. I mentioned Durrant earlier. Remember, this was not the last time that the two would end up meeting. Giving evidence about the glass shard, Scotland Yard scientist Michael Isaacs said that he had examined hundreds of fragments and pieces of green glass which had been sent to the yard over the course of the investigation. These were recovered from the train and on the tracks between Micheldever and Basingstoke. With these, he had been able to fit together what he termed the vase of the bottle. The pieces bore the letters GBC and code numbers which positively confirmed the bottle to have been Quester sherry. The glass fragment found in Derek's pocket was only just visible to the naked eye, and while Mr. Isaacs said that there was a possibility that it could have come from the neck of the bottle, he couldn't say for sure. It's interesting to note that on the same day that Detective Sergeant Durrant seized Derek's clothing, he also recovered a number of Quester sherry bottles from a shed which adjoined the house. Derek Pye could not account for the glass shard found in his jacket pocket, except to say that it may have been from a bottle that he had once taken home. For their part, forensics found no traces of blood or anything to link the glass to Yvonne. Similarly, when his clothing was examined by Margaret Pereira, a science officer at the police laboratory, the only blood to be found was on his shoes, and that turned out to be his own. Mr. McCreary admitted that while the prosecution maintained that Derek Pye's account of the day was completely false, there was no scientific evidence to relate the clothing to the murder. In the absence of physical proof, the prosecution attempted to unpick Derek's behaviour in the days between the murder and his arrest. He himself had claimed that he read about the murder in the papers, saying, "I read this in the Daily Mirror. It said the girl was murdered in a crowded train. No, I didn't think it was the train. Ours was not a crowded train." As an aside, if you want a nice illustration of how the papers can be prone to getting information wrong and how tricky it can be to piece together an accurate picture of events, you don't have to look any further than the Mirror's coverage of this particular piece of information. With what sounds awfully like pride, an article told of how a copy of the Mirror from Tuesday, June the 30th of that year had been brandished in court to show exactly what it was that Derek would have read. That seems all well and good, but when I checked for the article, I couldn't find mention of the murder at all in the June 30th edition of the paper. The first mention of the murder actually came on Wednesday the 1st of July. The reporter who was there in court that day couldn't even get the dates of their own paper's article right. Perhaps this underlines the believability of Derek's claim that because the article stated the train was crowded, he did not make the connection. Having said that, you might be thinking that if you were to witness a strange scene like the one Derek had been party to, and then that you were to read about a murder having taken place at a similar time to that, you might put two and two together. We know already that Derek was an intelligent man, and yet at every turn he seems to have failed to have read what was right in front of him. I also don't know how it is that Derek later realised that he would have been on the train and witnessed Yvonne and her murder when he hadn't previously made the connection. These holes and unexplained connections are part of what makes compiling these cases so frustrating. They also mean that at this point in the tale, you could be forgiven for thinking that everything sounds a little too far-fetched. You might think that it was a bit too convenient for the killer that Derek was to witness the murder and yet remained completely clueless as to what he had seen. It might sound like a fantasy. And yet, his version of events was in part backed up by several witnesses. The first, a railway porter at Winchester, said that he'd seen a man who resembled Pye's description of the mystery person getting into Yvonne's carriage at the station. Added to that were a handful of witnesses who claimed to have seen a man alighting from the train carriage just before Basingstoke. Signalman Fred Froud told the court how the train had slowed to a walking speed just before the station, and James Sharrocks, a lookout man for linesmen who was working on the line, said that he saw a man acting suspiciously by the tracks. When asked in court if it looked like Derek Pye, he categorically stated, "That is not the person I saw." Mrs. Janet Agnell, who worked at a nearby factory, also claimed to have seen the man, as did Ronald Bridges, a tractor driver who had been working in a field nearby. Mr. Bridges said, "I started cutting the field about 4 p.m. About 4:30 p.m. I saw a man. He was walking up the side of the field from the direction of the railway line." These eyewitness testimonies appear to have been the crux of the case in Derek Pye's favour. Yes, there was a small shard of glass found in his pocket, which might have matched the murder weapon, but it bore no blood, nor was there any on the clothing he claimed to have been wearing. And not only that, but a man answering the description he'd given of the killer was seen by multiple witnesses around the railway tracks at about the time the train slowed to a walk, just before it pulled into Basingstoke. These witnesses must have gone some way towards undermining the prosecution's version of events, and it is with all this information that the jury would retire to consider their verdict. Before they were sent to deliberate, however, the judge summarised the case, finishing by telling them, "It's the sort of thing which makes one's blood boil to think that in the year 1964 there is, or was on the 29th of June, any man capable of such a foul deed." He went on to say, though, "It is quite improper and quite the wrong approach for you to say, 'Well, here is a ghastly crime, somebody's got to suffer.'" For their part, the jury do not seem to have been of this mindset, and it took them just 6.5 hours to reach the conclusion that Derek Pye was not guilty of murder. He reportedly showed no emotion as the verdict was read, perhaps because the arson and housebreaking charges were still hanging over his head. Derek Pye might have been cleared, but he was not yet a free man. It's difficult to know what to think here. It's obvious that police didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction, And yet, unlike so many other murders of this type, there are no reports of cold case reviews, just the one contemporary article on Yvonne's murder. There are no signs that since Derek was cleared, police have made any move to attempt to find a murderer, which seems to me to be a sign that they thought they had their man and that he managed to get away with it. I think back to the article on the arsons, how the prosecutor stated, whenever there was a fire, Derek Pye seemed to be around. He would tell people that fires had started. He knew this because he had started them himself. This is a man who, in the words of his son, could be emotionally and physically abusive towards his family. He stole and lied and was there to mutely witness all number of criminal acts, but these things do not necessarily make him a murderer. Confessing to having been witness to a crime does not make him a murderer. Derek Pye may have been a man who allowed his desires and demons to rule him, but in the murder of Yvonne Laker, he was found not guilty. And when you look at the evidence presented in court, you can see why. Regardless of his guilt, Derek does not sound as if he had a nice life. He died estranged from his wife and children. And his death was perhaps accident, perhaps suicide. Still, no one knows. Derek himself was probably the one who best summed up his story when he said, "I tried it, and it did not work." As for Yvonne, she is no more than the memory of a teenage girl, a name on a headstone in a New Milton graveyard. At the funeral, a single wreath of rosebuds from her family rested on her white coffin. That day, there were special precautions taken to ensure that sightseers could not be there to witness her burial. And yet now, publicly, she's all but forgotten. A 15-year-old girl in black and white, who stands in the midday sun, smelling the sea air, and smiling at her grandfather as he takes her final photograph. This episode of Outlines was researched, written, performed and produced by Jess Carter. The music was composed by Elias Harding.